In 1979, Kiss released Dynasty, had one of the biggest hits, I Was Made for Loving You. It reached number 11 on the Billboard Hot 100 and has been a concert staple ever since. So now, 1 year later, they decided to release a follow-up album to Dynasty, which was called Unmasked. This album was a failure, so that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the way they changed their sound, the change in the musical landscape at the time, the internal problems with two of their members, and the critical reception of the album. Finally, at the end, I will reveal how the album is perceived by fans many years later, which might actually surprise you. Unmasked is the 8th studio album by American rock band Kiss, released on May 20, 1980, Casablanca Records. It's kind of a strange album. It was called Unmasked, but they wouldn't actually unmask until about 3 years later. I don't remember having this one as a kid, but I bought it as a teenager, so it holds some nostalgia for me. In other words, I don't hate it, but I agree they changed their sound. So if you compare it to their classic album from the 70s, it's a little different. So let's talk about that one a little more. One of the biggest factors was their departure from their hard rock sound. We start to see that on the previous album, Dynasty. But Dynasty had better songs and rode the disco wave. Something that will be relevant later on. The band thought this would broaden their commercial appeal, but it actually had the opposite effect. One of the byproducts of moving from hard rock to pop was having a slicker production. Kiss have always been known to have a very raw production value. Take a look at their album, Hotter Than Hell. That album had a very muddy production, but it is considered one of their best. The slicker production was also the work of their producer, Vinnie Poncia, who had a background producing pop albums. He also co-wrote I Was Made for Loving You, which was a big hit for the band. So they're trying to recreate that sound with more compression on the guitars and drums. Then there were the keyboards. Kiss was always a hard rock band that just had the twin guitars, bass, and drums. But this album had more keyboards than any of the previous albums, so that gave it more of a poppy sound. The songs were also structured to have catchy melodies and more hooks, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but when you sacrifice the hard rock guitars for a catchy pop song, you're not going to please their core fans. Paul Stanley was also influenced by R&B and soul, something that he explored on his 1978 solo albums. In turn, there were fewer guitar riffs. Keep in mind, this band was known for their riffs, which were apparent on songs like Detroit Rock City and God of Thunder. Ace Frehley still had some solos, but they were uninspired, also due to the fact that he also had one foot out the door, as well as I'll talk about that later. Here are a few examples of songs on the album that lacked that hard rock sound. A perfect example would be Shandy. It's a soft rock track with melodic hooks. Not the first ballad, considering they had a big hit with Beth. But it was very sugary. They also made a music video that never got a lot of exposure. Despite the cheese factor, it was a hit in Australia and New Zealand, but failed to chart in the US. There's also Tomorrow, which was a Paul Stanley song that was considered to be power pop and sounded more like the band The Raspberries or something like Rick Springfield. Paul also wrote the keyboard-heavy Easy As It Seems. This song has a melodic rock sound, and it was Gene with the weirdest song title ever. He had a song called She's So European. That song sounded like a pop song, something that Gene was not known for, as he was usually the guy behind some of the heavier Kiss songs. The main reason for this change in sound was because they were trying for another hit after the success of the single I Was Made for Loving You, which came out right at the time. It was capitalizing on the disco phenomenon, but disco was becoming less popular by 1980. Therefore, the songs on this album are not as popular. And the fact that they weren't going to go for a disco sound anyway, they just want to have a very accessible sound that reached a wider audience, but it didn't really work. Not only that, these sappy pop songs were not even that popular in the early 80s. Back then, new wave was becoming very popular. failed to ride this trend. Not only that, there was this big anti-disco movement started by Chicago radio DJ Steve Dahl, where he coined the phrase "disco sucks." He even destroyed disco records on air. There was something called the Disco Demolition Night that took place on July 12, 1979. On that night, thousands of rock fans brought disco records to be exploded on the field between games of a White Sox doubleheader. This caused a riot, the field was damaged, and the White Sox had to forfeit the second game. A lot of radio stations stopped playing disco around this time. Not only that, there was a lot of racism and homophobia tied to disco, as it originated in the Black, Latino, and LGBTQ clubs. So once disco became mainstream, these minorities got more attention, and some people didn't want to be associated with them. But what does all this have to do with Kiss? It was because they were also associated with disco after having the big hit, "I Was Made for Loving You." So that may have pushed people away from the band. Another major problem was the fact that the band was not getting along, but they didn't want the public to know about it. So they tried to maintain an image that the band was still intact. But the truth is that was mostly Gene and Paul at this point. Let's start with Peter Criss. He was not in the band anymore, but they wanted it to be a secret. So he is credited on the album cover. He was in the music video for Shandy, but he didn't play on the album at all. It was Anton Fig who played drums on the album. He was a drummer for Ace Frehley's 1978 solo album. He also played on most of the Dynasty album as well. Peter had been checked out for a while now. He wanted to play a different style of music. This was apparent on his 1978 solo album as well as his solo album Out of Control that was released in September of 1980. There was also Peter's drug and alcohol abuse, which was causing a lot of problems and leading him to missed rehearsals, and he was just difficult to work with. Then there was Ace Frehley. He also had a big substance abuse problem, and that didn't help the situation. Not only that, he didn't like the direction that the band was going in. This goes back to his 1978 solo album. It was the one that was a hard rock album, and it was also the best one and the most successful. He didn't want to play pop music. Not only that, with Peter gone, he was often outvoted by Paul and Gene whenever he pitched an idea. Despite this, he had 3 songs on Unmasked, which he sang lead. They were Talk to Me, Two Sides of the Coin, and Torpedo Girl. Talk to Me was the most like Ace Frehley sounding track of them all. Frehley would eventually leave the band after the next album, Music from the Elder. Then it was Gene and Paul. They were left to make the album almost all by themselves. Therefore, they had to find some outside writers and producers, which made the album sound even less like a Kiss album. In the end, Paul Stanley would go on to say that he never liked the Unmasked album. He described it as wimpy and crappy. He said that many of the songs lost something on their way to the vinyl in an attempt to make it sound more commercial. Paul was not the only one who didn't like the album. A lot of critics didn't like the album. One of their criticisms was that the band was not in a good place. Peter was out, Ace was disconnected from the band. This led to a lot of ideas that were just put together, resulting in an album that doesn't feel cohesive. In addition, critics said that there were a lot of filler tracks in the album, especially ones that sounded like softer pop tracks. Then there were the good songs like Ace's Talk to Me that stand out in the album, but feel like it belonged on one of his solo albums. Critics also mentioned the fact that they were trying to land another I Was Made for Loving You. Another factor mentioned by critics was that while Kiss were getting soft and commercial, heavy metal and or hard rock was becoming more popular with albums like the debut of Iron Maiden. Judas Priest had just released British Steel. The law, breaking the law, breaking the law, breaking the law. Later on, AC/DC would be releasing Back in Black, which would be like one of the biggest albums of all time. Critics also accused the band of trying to reach a wider audience for the sole purpose of selling more merchandise, as Kiss merch was at its peak in 1980. I don't think anyone doubts that, because we all know that this band is always looking to make money. Even Gene Simmons once said, "Kiss is not a band, it's a brand."
We make Kiss condoms, we make Kiss caskets, we'll get you coming and we'll get you going.
Finally, how does the album hold up in the eyes of the fans? Surprisingly, a lot of fans see this as a hidden gem that's just a snapshot of their more experimental phase. I think it depends on how you look at it. They changed their sound, and it was not what fans wanted back in 1980. But looking back, Comparing it to some of their no makeup albums from the 80s, this one's not too bad. Songs are kind of fun. I would even rank it higher than some of their later albums. If you want to hear more about their Dynasty album, I did a video about it last year. I'm going to stick that right here for you to watch next. In the meantime, please like this video. It helps me with the YouTube algorithm. Please subscribe if you're not already. I do rock and metal reviews, rankings, and more. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.